Up until recently, the character of Gerald Robotnik has always been somewhat of an enigma. A seemingly normal, albeit genius scientist related to Eggman, who lost his mind after losing his granddaughter in a tragic accident. But as for who he was, the man behind the ultimate life form and the countless other scientific breakthroughs made on the Space Colony Ark, that has always remained somewhat of a mystery. So naturally, when a copy of his diary was released alongside Sonic X Shadow Generations, the very same diary that set the events of Sonic Adventure 2 in motion, as a massive Shadow the Hedgehog fan and huge lore nerd in general, I couldn't wait to overthink every single page. On the inside cover, we can see a note left for the gun commander, Abraham Tower, from the person who retrieved it. They were tasked by Abe with uncovering evidence on the Ark incident 50 years ago, but say that progress has been difficult. Abraham's predecessor was very thorough in his cover-up efforts, and all that survived was Gerald's journal. The note gives ironic credit to Eggman for discovering it around the time of Sonic Adventure 2, implying that that's the only reason it still exists at all, and details the retrieval of it from one of his bases sometime after that game. Dude even took the time to put his own name on the back. You gotta love the shamelessness. The note expresses frustration that the book is severely damaged and that there's no way of recovering its lost pages, ending by saying it's a pity because they would have liked to have gained a greater insight into Gerald and Maria's lives. Many people seem to think the mysterious T signing off is Topaz, the gun agent and close friend of Rouge the Bat from Sonic X. But anime crossover unlikelihood aside, purely based on how it signed off, personal disappointment that they couldn't learn more about Gerald and Maria, I'm thinking it's someone else entirely. But we'll get to that in good time. Showing just how damaged and incomplete this journal is, the first entry listed is number 42. In this entry, Gerald talks about his pride in his research and the discoveries they've produced. Being labeled a genius in his own time is something he not so humbly keeps in the forefront of his mind, but says that even that doesn't compare to his pride in his boys. Both names are of course redacted, but he brims with joy as he writes about them graduating early at the top of their class, saying that they will both have their doctorates in no time. With one specializing in archaeology and the other in robotics, Gerald chuckles to himself about them being chips off the old block, saying he can't wait to see what scientific marvels they give to the world. I think it's safe to assume that the son with a passion for robotics is most likely Eggman's dad, and that the son who loves archaeology is Maria's. It's funny though, because Eggman, his grandson, arguably loves both. Maybe not always for the right reasons, but we constantly see him excavating ruins in search of power, which probably plays into him idolizing his grandfather and wanting to be a great scientist like he was.
As a child, I looked up to my grandfather because of all the great things he accomplished in his life. He was my hero, and I wanted to be a great scientist like him.
It's clear to see that Gerald holds family as the most important thing in his life, which is only reinforced further by his next entry. With the birth of his first grandchild, Gerald is immediately transformed into the doting grandfather. The child's name is redacted of course, but we all know it's Maria. As his first grandchild, Gerald makes an instant connection with her. His perspective on life is immediately changed, and he now sees this little bundle in his arms as his true legacy, saying that everything he does from now on, he does for her. A theme which only grows stronger as this diary goes on. Gerald's next entry details how he first calculated the location of Angel Island after deciphering text on an ancient ring he found in the jungle. The jungle's name is redacted, and there's some debate as to which of the many jungles in the series it is, but my thinking is that it's probably the jungles of Mystic Ruins. As the landmass that Angel Island broke away from, and a place where members of the Echidna tribe lived previously, it would make sense that a ring referencing Angel Island's location would be found there. But if you have any other theories, be sure to share them in the comments. Going to the island alone to verify his findings, Gerald writes that he's greeted with the spectacle of an angelic island. While I'm confident Ian Flynn had a good chuckle with his choice of words, I still can't help but appreciate Gerald describing the island as angelic before he even knows its name. It's the little things. The little nerdy things. Gerald is in awe at the island's beauty, with its various biomes in close proximity to each other and the marvelous floating city in the sky. Nobody tell him what happens to that or who caused it, but most majestic of all is an elaborate shrine with a massive Chaos Emerald at its pinnacle. Despite what I said earlier about Eggman being inspired by his grandfather and having an interest in both robotics and archaeology, we see here that Gerald has a far more respectful approach. Where Eggman rips and tears in search of power, Gerald doesn't overstay his welcome. He doesn't even approach the shrine, despite every inch of his scientific mind screaming at him to explore and learn. He shows restraint, saying that even standing on the island's soil feels taboo. He ends the entry by saying that even though his stay was brief, the majesty of that emerald shrine will stay with him for the rest of his life. Something we know to be true as he went on to incorporate elements of it in his work. 15 entries and several torn pages later, Gerald details the most ambitious project of his life, the first orbital space colony. As a research facility designed to improve the lives of all mankind from the harshness of space, he christens it the Ark. When it comes to his own vanity though, at least Gerald has the self-awareness to acknowledge it, chuckling to himself about the station's self-indulgent design. In some not-so-subtle foreshadowing of the problems he will face in the future, Gerald goes on to write that his main concern is around the facility's funding. He knows the United Federation will support them, but is worried that the brunt of the money seems to be coming from GUN, the guardian units of nations. As a multinational defense force, Gerald is under no illusions about what they will want in exchange for funding. But perhaps displaying that classic Robotnik family hubris, he writes that he will figure something out when the time comes. After a considerable amount of time and over 200 journal entries later, the Ark is now completed, with work now well underway on a variety of projects. Gerald describes his work on the station as exciting, but caveats it by writing for good or for ill. He says they have discovered and have begun utilizing one of the legendary Chaos Emeralds, though he fails to mention where and how they found it. While excited about the possibilities this incredible power affords him, he laments about how GUN wish to wield this power, writing that their requests for weapons have become increasingly overt and decreasingly polite. Going over their heads, he contacts the president to request that he make GUN back off, and the president agrees, but then requests, as Gerald puts it, something equally obscene: a means of immortality. Gerald stresses that his aim is to improve life, not pervert it. He describes the endeavor as laughable, as intangible as a shadow. He refuses the president outright, though upon reflecting on the conversation, writes that he probably should have been more diplomatic about it. Mentally, Gerald is already showing signs of strain. Political pressures aside, he has also learned that his granddaughter Maria has fallen ill with no clear diagnosis. He wishes that he could look into this himself, but stresses that he's needed on the Ark. Ending the entry with some weak optimism, he hopes that Maria's illness will pass naturally, saying that she is too precious to be left to suffer. So Gerald is now under pressure from GUN to create weapons, despite the whole ethos and purpose of the Ark being to preserve and improve life. He hoped he could fall back on the president to rein in GUN's expectations, but he too wanted something just as morally questionable: everlasting life. You can see, even this early in the Ark's existence, that Gerald was already tremendously unhappy with how his work was being dictated. His morals already being trampled under the feet of faceless agencies, and were it not for his granddaughter falling ill, I suspect he would have walked away from the Ark and his warmongering overseers shortly after this entry. Entry 402 details the discovery of a Gizoid by Gerald's son. I assume Maria's father, seeing as he is the archaeologist. At first, the robot didn't garner much of Gerald's interest, until one day, when he was experimenting on a Chaos Emerald in close proximity to it, it started to move. After researching further on the relationship between this robot and Chaos Emeralds, Gerald discovers that this robot could have been the entity that wiped out the fourth great generation. It's been watching him in the lab since it arrived, and after crashing one of Gerald's computers with data on weaponry from its era, he learned that it can actually absorb and replicate those weapons, and likely weapons from the modern age too. Gerald worries what this might mean for the world were the Gizoid to fall into the wrong hands, but unfortunately this wouldn't be the only worry to weigh on Gerald's mind. Maria has now been diagnosed with neuroimmunodeficiency syndrome, a disease with no cure and has caused a steady decline in her health. Gerald pulls some strings to have her brought to the Ark so that he himself can assess and treat her, saying that the low gravity on the station should grant her some modest relief from her symptoms. I found it interesting how Gerald mentions that Maria's family were less than enthusiastic with his decision. Obviously they want to do everything in their power to keep Maria alive, but the fact that Gerald labels this as his decision leads to some interesting questions around power dynamics in the Robotnik family. Does Gerald hold enough sway that he can overrule his extended family on matters like this? Or did Gunn or some other agency just turn up and take her? Either way, it's an interesting choice of words by Gerald and something that stuck in my mind as I continued to read this journal. He quickly shifts tone after this though, writing about how Maria has basically become the adoptive daughter of everyone on the station and is loved by all, even becoming something of a big sister figure to a young Abraham Tower, the Ark's happy little accident, dropping the not-so-subtle hint that 2 researchers on the station became members of the 62 Mile High Club. Gerald writes that the president is becoming increasingly interested in his quest for immortality, and increasingly persistent about results. Just what it is that's causing the president to seek this power so aggressively is never made clear. Where at first Gerald had dismissed these requests out of hand, we can now see that he has opened his mind to the possibility if it might mean finding a cure for Maria in the process. Everything he does for her. Entry 515 details how Gunn have dropped all pretense in their communications with Gerald and are now flat out demanding weapons research, threatening the facility's funding if their demands aren't met. Gerald writes of his disappointment that even though he has agreed to the president's request and is actively working on Project Shadow, that even he can't seem to rein Gunn in, chuckling to himself that he now appears to have a gun to his head on the matter. All the redacting and they missed that joke. Gerald talks of a discovery he made years earlier around an ancient god of destruction called Chaos. Said to command the fury and force of the ocean, Gerald took inspiration from this creature and created AI-based devices that could hold various shapes in water and carry out a variety of actions. The artificial chaos we would all later go on to loathe. He then markets these devices to Gunn as autonomous weapons in an effort to keep them off his back, attempting to ease his conscience on the matter with some idealistic spin that they could also be used in search and rescue. I have no doubts that Gerald is a decent person, but it definitely seems he has somewhat stretched his moral compass once Maria falls ill. He feebly attempts to clear his conscience by envisioning these artificial chaos being used for good, but as an intelligent man, he knows exactly what they'll be used for. His love for Maria is just a far bigger motivation than his morals. In entry 530, Gerald writes that Project Shadow is now in full swing. With harnessing the limitless power of the Chaos Emeralds being the goal, the first step became siphoning that power and applying it safely to living tissue, leading to the invention of the Chaos Drives. Gerald says that direct application of a Chaos Emerald to a living creature seems too harsh, adding that any creature capable of directly interfacing with one would be fearsome indeed. Obviously, at this point, Gerald isn't aware of the ability of hedgehogs to not just interface with, but to ascend past all known limits with these emeralds. If he had been, he probably could have saved himself a lot of grief. With initial Chaos Drive tests showing promise, Gerald writes that he plans to begin trials on salamanders, chosen for their regenerative abilities and manageable size. To continue placating Gunn, Gerald provides them with the Chaos Drive technology to power their mechanized division. He laments powering machines of war, but writes that sacrifices must be made to save Maria, once again idealizing the situation by saying as a genius, he'll fix it all later. You can really see the mask starting to slip now with Gerald when it comes to his morals. With each new demand from Gunn, he is willing to compromise on his values more and more in the hopes that he can save his granddaughter. They now have the leverage they need over him to get whatever they want, and I think Gerald knows it. Unfortunately, in entry 568, Gerald writes that Project Shadow has reached an impasse. The salamander used in the trials reacted poorly to the chaos energy, growing in size so quickly that it could no longer support its own organs. Gerald quickly built it its own custom life support system, but the creature had also become increasingly aggressive and uncontrollable. But Gerald needs it alive. After all, it may still hold the answer to a cure for Maria. He writes that he will do everything in his power to keep it comfortable, and plans to hide it away in a remote corner of the Ark where it can't hurt anyone, giving us some nice insight into the origin of the Biolizard and how it came to be encapsulated. But Gerald worries about what to tell Maria. He doesn't want to lie to her, but fears the truth would be too cruel. Again, we see that classic Gerald compartmentalized logic. He frames his selective truths as wanting to avoid being cruel to Maria, when in reality it's a cruelty made by his own hand. He was the one who experimented on this creature, and I think it has less to do with burdening Maria, and more to do with not wanting his granddaughter to think badly of him. The scientist who strived to preserve and improve life straying into mad scientist territory. In entry 589, Gerald radiates with pride at the lovely young woman Maria is growing into. But that pride is marred by the heartbreak of watching someone so bright and energetic being ravaged by disease. He writes that because there are not always visible effects of her disease, that he has overheard his colleagues muttering to each other that there's actually nothing wrong with her. He describes this as infuriating and admits that he loses all restraint whenever Maria is slighted. The doting and protective grandfather that Gerald has been since the moment Maria was born has always shined through. And honestly, it's one of the most wholesome and admirable things about his character. Anyone would be lucky to have a grandfather like Gerald, but even he admits that his reasoning is tested whenever it comes to matters about Maria. And I think it's this trait alone that leads Gerald down the path he walks. He goes on to write that even on her worst day, when the pain and fear take over, that Maria remains a font of positivity. She endures for the day that she can finally go home, and has absolute faith that her grandfather will save her, which only piles even more pressure on poor Gerald. His family, though, don't seem to share Maria's faith in him. They either want her better or want her home, which basically sounds like cure her now and bring her home, or just bring her home so we can spend what time she has left by her side. And Gerald writes that sadly, he can do neither. And along with the ever-mounting pressure for more weapons research, he also has to bear the weight of his family's scorn. An increasingly broken man who is becoming more and more desperate. That desperation is laid bare in entry 616, as Gerald details his first meeting with Black Doom. Returning to Earth's orbit on the Black Comet's 50-year cycle, Doom offers Gerald everything he needs to complete Project Shadow. All he wants in return is for the ultimate life form he creates to become his herald for the future invasion of Earth. With Black Doom's DNA, Gerald's small but sturdy biped could now interact perfectly with chaos energy, and he was now also one step closer to finding a cure for Maria. Black Doom wanted a herald of war. Gunn wanted Project Shadow to produce undying soldiers. But, and not for the first time, we see Gerald's hubris on full display, saying he will play them both for fools. In entry 620, Gerald talks about why he originally named this project Project Shadow, writing that it was initially his attempt to express scorn for the project, mocking the very idea of eternal life by comparing it to chasing shadows. He says that the name continued to be the perfect representation of the project, as it sounded appropriately villainous for perverting the fundamentals of life itself. But that would all go on to change when his granddaughter put things into perspective for him. Gazing through the glass in awe at the creature inside, Maria says that a shadow tells you which way to go to find the light. With just one sentence, she cut through Gerald's cynicism and gave him a whole new outlook on everything. Gave him hope, taking a name born out of scorn and repurposing it with honor and virtue. Gerald no longer sees Shadow as some dark creature, but instead a champion of life and hope. He writes that he would never have seen that were it not for Maria, saying that she is a truly remarkable force for good in the world, ending the entry by saying that he must save her, no matter the cost. It's great to see that force of positivity that Maria is for Shadow applied to the other people in her life. Like Amy Rose, Maria has a gift for cutting through the vitriol and putting right and wrong into perspective. And it's easy to see how everyone on the Ark fell in love with her and how she had such a huge impact on both Gerald and Shadow. Who wouldn't want a loyal and kind friend who can chase away all our darkest thoughts? Over the next several entries, Gerald details his progress on the Gizoid his son brought him. Discovering that the robot can be linked to a master by showing it power, Gerald links the Gizoid to him by showing it some small arms weapons. Hoping to prevent it from being abused by anyone else, he also attempts to instruct it to never absorb any dangerous technology. His efforts, however, end up being in vain. As it turns out, other researchers on the station have since figured out how to re-establish a link with the bot by simply giving it more power than its previous master. While Gerald realizes this poses a great danger, the powers that be are now threatening to shut Project Shadow down. And with Shadow so close to completion and the cure for his granddaughter in sight, he can't afford to lose Shadow now. It's his only hope to save Maria. So once again, Gerald has to compromise on his morals and hand the Gizoid over to Gunn. But not big or flashy enough, even that doesn't satisfy the top brass, prompting Gerald to create the Eclipse Cannon. Built directly into the Ark's central reactor, Gerald sees it as a checkmate. The cannon will be big and powerful enough to keep the military off his back, but also possess too much firepower to fire at Earth without destroying the entire planet. The warmongers will never be able to fire it. It will, however, be the perfect defense against the Black Arm's aliens when they return. Knowing that he himself will be long gone by then, Gerald sees the Eclipse Cannon as a gift for Shadow. A weapon to use in a battle he never asked for. You can now see clear as day that Gerald's morals and obligations to the world have taken a back seat to those few he holds dear. His personal goals have now trumped the needs of the planet, and all that really matters to him now are Maria and Shadow. He gave the Gizoid to Gunn with full knowledge of what that could mean, and rationalized his creation of the Eclipse Cannon with the idealistic logic that it could never be turned on humans. Gerald isn't that naive. It never takes much for these weapons to fall into the wrong hands. Entry 651, though, holds a different vibe entirely. Focusing now on preparing Shadow for the world, Gerald writes about working alongside his granddaughter to make Shadow's transition as smooth as possible. You can really tell how much he values this time with her, as despite recognizing that a lot of the work was superficial, he is just happy to be with her. Maria doesn't know the full scope of Shadow's purpose, but she knows that he will be under tremendous strain. So while she sketches out some flashy accessories to help Shadow get around and focus his energy, Gerald carries out research into chaos control so that Shadow doesn't have to learn it all by himself. It really is a nice entry, but even the good times come stained with the negative thoughts of the problems he faces. Alongside the various agencies breathing down his neck about weapons and the looming return of the Black Arms, Gerald has also learned of a rift forming between his two sons. It's likely that Eggman's side of the family probably felt like less of a priority than Maria's. Family discussions were probably always heavily focused on them, and this inevitably led to resentment between both sides. This is evident in Eggman's journal entry on Maria from Sonic Frontiers, and Gerald's journal puts that whole dynamic into sharp focus. Maybe there was even some resentment towards little Ivo for being too much like his grandfather. He admired him so much while his family were growing to despise him. It's just a theory, but that could explain why Eggman broke away from his family as he grew up. Gerald is devastated that his love for his sons has become a divisive issue, and truly comes across as a man who feels that the walls are closing in around him, writing that he is running out of time. In entry 670, Gerald writes of the completion of Project Shadow, saying that Shadow himself is now awake. Gerald describes Shadow's ability to parse and apply the data he programmed into his brain as remarkable, writing that he also shows no signs of instability or mutation. But for Gerald, all of this pales in comparison to how quickly Shadow and Maria have become friends. She is his guide to the world, and he is her stalwart companion. Gerald says that he's never witnessed such instantaneous mutual friendship and trust between two beings. They give him hope for the future and probably serve as a refreshing reminder of the work Gerald did before he was forced down the path of weapons and war. Maria's parents have also been blessed with a baby girl, the baby sister we see Maria speak about in Shadow Generations. She is tested negative for the genetic markers of Maria's disease, but the subtext of his correspondence with Maria's family is still loud and clear. He needs to save Maria. He must get his family back, and Shadow is the key to it all. It's heartbreaking that Gerald knew he would lose his family should he fail to save Maria. He is already motivated enough by his love for his granddaughter, and the thought of losing her seems to scare him more than any alien warlord or government agency ever could. But the added pressure of your entire family turning their backs on you is one hell of a consequence. I think it's very likely that Maria's younger sister is this T character, the person who retrieved this journal for Abe. Her being mentioned in this diary as well as the game seems like far too much effort for just a throwaway reference, so my gut tells me this is her. It makes her desire to find out more about Gerald and Maria make much more sense, and I wouldn't be surprised to see her turn up in a future story. A story that involves Shadow? We can live in hope, right? The next few entries show the beginning of Gerald's downfall as events start to spiral out of his control. His entry numbers have question marks beside them before he gives up the pretense entirely, saying that he has lost track of the days. Gerald is strained. He writes that the Gizoid went completely out of control and rampaged throughout the Ark, destroying most of the facility in the process. He doesn't know how the researchers managed stopping it in the end, but in all likelihood they had a little help. But the Gizoid's rampage had the added effect of causing the artificial chaos to go haywire. Luckily, Shadow was there to pacify them, but unfortunately, the damage was done. The Ark systems automatically sent an SOS to Gunn when the station was under attack, and Gerald is now dreading the reprimand he must face. With entry numbers and readable formatting completely abandoned now, Gerald seems to be re-evaluating his creations, questioning all of the choices he's made in pursuit of the ultimate lifeform. When it comes to the Gizoid and Shadow, he says that he equipped both weapons with hearts. He theorizes that if power is not something that is to be obtained for oneself, but is instead something born from a heart that yearns for someone, then all conflict should cease to exist. Ending by asking that if anyone is listening to his prayer, bring hope to humanity. The final entry is lifted verbatim from his speech in Sonic Adventure 2, and I think he puts it best.
I found Maria's name among those who died when the Ark was shut down. She meant everything to me, and I couldn't bear the thought that she died because of my research. I lost everything. I had nothing more to live for. I went insane! All I could think about was to avenge her. Somehow, some way. I got scared as I no longer was able to control my thoughts. All I could think about was that I wanted it all to end. Based on my original projections, I was able to complete my project, Shadow. I designed its mind to be perfect, pure. I will leave everything to him.
Gerald had lost everything. The granddaughter he loved, the family he failed, his surrogate son, his life's work. He had already been under unimaginable stress dealing with people and agencies who shared none of his values and sought only to use him for their own selfish needs. But to lose the person he had been working so hard to save, the person who he loved enough to compromise all of his morals for, all while having his legacy erased and covered up, that was just too much for him. Even a great mind can only take so much. Gerald's story is a tragic one. A once good and noble scientist who wanted nothing more than to help the world, twisted and warped by power-hungry puppeteers who were happy to abuse his situation with Maria to extract everything they could from him. I don't get the impression Gerald would have ever gone along with the demands of Gunn or the President were it not for Maria. He promised her the day she was born that everything he did from then on, he did for her. And that's the one thing about Gerald's character that never wavered. Gerald and Shadow are alike in many ways. They both were driven by a promise to Maria. They both are essentially good, but prone to bending that good when it comes to protecting the people they love. And they both love Maria more than anything. Shadow's mind and heart were created by Gerald after all, so maybe it's no surprise they shared the same values, especially Maria. I always felt that Gunn were the antagonist in this situation, and for me, this diary all but proves it. Hell, we could probably even throw the president of that time into that role as well. But I don't think the story of Gerald and Maria is over yet though. If indeed this T-person is Maria's sister and she joined Gunn to uncover answers about her family, I get the impression there is more to be told. Lore aside though, Gerald's journal is honestly just a brilliant story all round. It's not just a bunch of random references and added lore for the sake of it. There's actually pacing and new details that make the original story even more meaningful. The sad tale of a once great professor who valued family and decency above all else, descending into madness. The saddest part being how his attempts to save Maria ultimately drove a wedge between his sons and divided his family, destroying the very thing he wanted to save. They either wanted her better or wanted her home, and Gerald could do neither. But now, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Did you enjoy reading Gerald's journal? What did you think of its expansion on Gerald and Maria's characters? And who do you think this T-person is? Are we due a story with Shadow and Maria's sister? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and make sure to turn on notifications to see more from me. There's plenty more videos on Shadow on the way, not least of which being his appearance in the third Sonic movie, so make sure to stick around. If you'd like to support the channel and see your name credited at the end of my videos, you can become a patron on Patreon or a YouTube channel member. Any support is much appreciated, and a huge thank you to the awesome people who already have. But for now, a big thank you for watching. And as always guys, take care.